Imagine being told that you have 3 days to live. 3 days to say goodbye to your family, to look your wife in the eyes one last time, to hold your children knowing you'll never see them grow up. Now imagine that instead of running, instead of hiding, instead of begging for mercy, you walk straight into the mouth of hell itself. You don't do it for glory. You don't do it for fame. You do it because someone has to. And if not you, then who? This is the story of 300 men who knew they were going to die. They knew it with absolute certainty. There was no hope of survival, no chance of rescue, no possibility of victory. And yet they marched forward anyway, into a narrow mountain pass where the fate of Western civilization would be decided. This is the story of Leonidas and the 300 Spartans, and what happened at a place called Thermopylae. But more than that, it's a story about what happens when ordinary men are asked to do something extraordinary. When a handful of warriors stand against an empire. When courage becomes the only weapon that matters. Welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving deep into one of history's most legendary last stands. But I'm not just going to tell you what happened. I'm going to show you why it mattered, why we still talk about it 2,500 years later, and what these 300 men can teach us about courage, duty, and sacrifice. If you're ready for one of the greatest true stories ever told, hit that subscribe button, because this is going to be intense. Let's begin at the beginning. The year is 480 BC. The Persian Empire, the largest and most powerful empire the world has ever seen, is coming for Greece. King Xerxes, the king of kings, the ruler of millions, sits on a throne of gold and commands armies so vast that when they march, they drink rivers dry. Ancient historians claimed his army numbered over 2 million men. Modern scholars think it was closer to 100,000 to 300,000. But here's the thing. The exact number doesn't matter. What matters is that it was more soldiers than most Greeks had ever seen in their entire lives. And Xerxes wanted revenge. 10 years earlier, his father Darius had tried to conquer Greece and failed at the Battle of Marathon. The Greeks, outnumbered and outmatched, had somehow won. They had embarrassed the Persian Empire. They had proven that the great king of kings could bleed. Xerxes had spent a decade preparing for this moment. He had built bridges across the Hellespont so his army could walk from Asia into Europe. He had dug a canal through a peninsula just to make the journey easier. He had assembled warriors from 46 different nations. Persians, Medes, Indians, Ethiopians, Arabs. Every corner of his empire contributed soldiers to this revenge mission. The message was clear. Greece would fall. The only question was how long it would take. Now, let's talk about Greece. Because here's what most people don't understand. Greece wasn't a country. It was a collection of city-states that spent most of their time fighting each other. Athens, Corinth, Thebes, Sparta. They all spoke Greek, they all worshipped the same gods, but they were independent, often hostile, and rarely agreed on anything. Getting them to work together was like herding cats. Angry, heavily armed cats. When news came that Xerxes was marching with the largest army ever assembled, most Greek city-states panicked. Some immediately surrendered, offering earth and water to Xerxes as symbols of submission. Others debated what to do. Some wanted to fight. Some wanted to hide behind their walls and hope the storm would pass. And some saw an opportunity. Sparta was different. Sparta had been preparing for this moment for generations. While other Greek cities valued art, philosophy, trade, and democracy, Sparta valued one thing above all else: war. Spartan society was built around creating the perfect warrior. From the age of 7, Spartan boys were taken from their families and put into the agoge, a brutal training system designed to strip away weakness and forge living weapons. They learned to endure pain, to survive on nothing, to obey without question, and to fight without mercy. Spartan warriors were the special forces of the ancient world. They were professionals in a world of amateurs. When a Spartan army marched, other Greeks watched in awe. When they fought, enemies fled in terror. They didn't retreat. They didn't surrender. They died standing, or they came home victorious. There was no middle ground. And leading Sparta in 480 BC was a man named Leonidas. He was around 60 years old, which in the ancient world meant he was considered elderly for a warrior. He had been king for about 10 years. He had 2 sons, a wife named Gorgo who was known for her intelligence and sharp wit, and the respect of every Spartan warrior. But most importantly, Leonidas had something rare. He had perspective. See, Leonidas wasn't supposed to be king. He was a younger son. His older brothers were supposed to rule. But his older half-brother died without an heir, and suddenly Leonidas, the third choice, became king of Sparta. He had earned his crown not through birthright alone, but through proving himself. He knew what it meant to fight for something. He knew what it meant to be underestimated. And he knew, when the Persians came, that someone would have to make a stand. The Greeks held a council to decide their strategy. The Persians were coming from the north, marching down towards southern Greece where Athens and Sparta and most of the important city-states were located. The question was simple. Where do you stop them? Some suggested defending the Isthmus of Corinth, a narrow strip of land in southern Greece. Easy to defend, but it meant abandoning all of northern Greece without a fight. Athens and other northern cities refused. They wanted to fight further north, to buy time, to make the Persians bleed for every inch of Greek soil. And that's when someone mentioned Thermopylae. The Hot Gates. A narrow coastal pass in central Greece where the mountains came right down to the sea. At its narrowest point, the pass was only 15 meters wide. Barely wide enough for a wagon. It was a natural bottleneck. A place where terrain mattered more than numbers. A place where a small force, if they were brave enough, could hold off an entire army. At least for a little while. Leonidas volunteered to take a force to Thermopylae and hold the pass. But here's where the story gets complicated. Sparta was in the middle of a religious festival. The Carnea. During this festival, Spartan law forbade them from going to war. The same thing had happened 10 years earlier at Marathon. The Spartans had wanted to help, but their laws prevented them from marching until the festival was over. By the time they arrived, the battle was already won. Leonidas knew that if he waited for the festival to end, the Persians would already be in southern Greece. There would be no time to stop them. So he made a decision that would echo through history. He would take a small advance force to Thermopylae immediately. Not the full Spartan army. Just his personal bodyguard. 300 warriors. The best of the best. And according to some ancient sources, he chose these 300 men based on a very specific criteria. They all had sons. Think about that for a moment. Leonidas didn't choose the youngest warriors, the strongest, or the most ambitious. He chose fathers. Men who had already passed on their bloodline. Men who had something to lose. Men who understood the weight of sacrifice. Because Leonidas knew something that he probably didn't share with everyone. This wasn't a holding action. This wasn't a delaying tactic. This was a suicide mission. Before he left, Leonidas spoke with his wife Gorgo. Ancient historians recorded her asking him what she should do while he was gone. His answer was simple and heartbreaking. Marry a good man and have good children. He was telling her goodbye. He was telling her to move on. He knew he wasn't coming back. The 300 Spartans marched north, and along the way, other Greek city-states joined them. Thespians sent 700 hoplites. Thebans sent 400. Other smaller cities contributed a few hundred here, a few dozen there. By the time they reached Thermopylae, Leonidas commanded somewhere between 4,000 and 7,000 Greek warriors. But everyone knew the Spartans were the backbone. The Spartans were the reason anyone else had the courage to stand. They arrived at Thermopylae and immediately began preparing defenses. The pass itself was already defensible, but Leonidas ordered his men to rebuild an old wall that stood at the narrowest point. They stacked stones, created a barrier, and prepared for what was coming. And then they waited. Days passed. Scouts brought reports of the Persian advance. The army was so large that it took 7 days and 7 nights for it to fully cross the Hellespont bridges. The sky darkened with dust from their march. Local Greeks who saw the army approaching fled in terror. And then the Persians arrived. Ancient sources describe the moment when Persian scouts first saw the Spartans. The scouts expected to find an army preparing for battle, digging trenches, sharpening weapons, looking nervous. Instead, they found Spartan warriors exercising. Combing their long hair. Completely unconcerned. The scouts reported this back to Xerxes, who was baffled. One of his advisors, a Greek exile named Demaratus who had once been king of Sparta himself, explained. This is what Spartans do before they fight to the death. They prepare their bodies and make themselves beautiful for the grave. Xerxes still didn't believe that a few thousand Greeks would actually stand and fight. He sent a message to Leonidas. A simple message. Surrender your arms. Leonidas sent back an equally simple reply. Molon Labe. Come and take them. This phrase has become legendary. Come and take them. 3 words that meant. We will not surrender. We will not retreat. If you want our weapons, you will have to pry them from our cold dead hands. Xerxes was insulted. He was furious. But he was also curious. He waited 4 days, giving the Greeks time to reconsider, time to realize the hopelessness of their situation and flee. They didn't. On the 5th day, Xerxes gave the order. Attack. Destroy them. Wave after wave of Persian soldiers charged into the pass. Medes first. Disciplined, well-trained warriors from Persia's eastern provinces. They rushed forward with shields, spears, and the confidence of men who had conquered empires. And they crashed into the Spartan line like water hitting a stone wall. The pass was so narrow that the Persians couldn't use their numbers. They couldn't flank. They couldn't surround. They could only come straight forward, where the Spartans were waiting. And here's where Spartan training made all the difference. The phalanx. The Greek formation where warriors stand shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping, spears pointing forward. It's not about individual heroics. It's about unity. About trust. About knowing that the man next to you will hold the line no matter what. The Spartans had trained in the phalanx since childhood. They moved as one organism. They breathed as one. And when the Persians crashed into them, the Spartans didn't budge. The fighting was brutal. Spears shattered. Swords broke. Men screamed and died in that narrow pass. The Persians pushed forward with courage, but courage wasn't enough. The terrain favored the Greeks. The training favored the Greeks. And the sheer stubborn refusal to give one single inch of ground favored the Greeks. By the end of the first day, the Persians had gained nothing. The pass was still held. And the ground was covered with Persian dead. Xerxes sent in his immortals. The elite of the Persian army. 10,000 warriors who were called immortals because whenever one died, he was immediately replaced, so their number never diminished. They were the best Persia had. Armored, experienced, loyal to Xerxes without question. If anyone could break the Greek line, it was them. They charged into the pass with discipline and skill. And they were slaughtered just like everyone else. The Spartans used a tactic that became legendary. They would pretend to retreat, drawing the Persians forward. The Persians, thinking the Greeks were finally breaking, would charge ahead, breaking their formation, rushing to claim victory. And then the Spartans would turn, lock shields, and slam into the disorganized Persians like a hammer. It worked again and again. The Persians couldn't figure it out. How could 300 warriors, with a few thousand allies, hold off an empire? For 2 days, the battle raged. The Persians attacked again and again. Different units, different strategies, different times of day. Nothing worked. The pass held. The Greeks stood. Xerxes began to realize that this wasn't going to be easy. That these weren't normal soldiers. That maybe, just maybe, he had underestimated what desperation and courage could accomplish. But Xerxes had something the Greeks didn't. Information. A local Greek man, a shepherd named Ephialtes, came to Xerxes with an offer. For a reward, he would show the Persians a secret path. A mountain trail that wound through the hills and came out behind the Greek position. A way to bypass Thermopylae entirely and trap the defenders between two armies. Xerxes immediately sent his immortals, under cover of darkness, along this path. They marched through the night, guided by Ephialtes, moving silently through the mountains. The Greeks had posted a guard on this trail. 1,000 Phocian warriors whose job was to watch for exactly this kind of flanking maneuver. But the Phocians weren't Spartans. When they heard the immortals approaching at dawn, when they saw the massive force coming toward them through the trees, they panicked. They retreated to higher ground instead of fighting. The immortals ignored them and kept marching. The path was open. The trap was set. A Greek scout raced back to Thermopylae with the news. The Persians are behind us. We're surrounded. We have hours, maybe less, before they close the trap. Leonidas called a council. The situation was clear. If they stayed, they would be caught between two armies and completely destroyed. If they left now, they could retreat, save most of the army, and fight another day. The other Greek leaders argued for retreat. Live to fight another day. Don't throw away lives for a position that's already lost. But Leonidas saw something they didn't. If the entire Greek force retreated now, the Persians would be free to march straight into southern Greece. Athens would fall. Sparta would be threatened. Everything they had fought for would be lost. But if someone stayed behind and kept fighting, even for a few more hours, it would buy precious time. Time for the Greek fleet to reposition. Time for Athens to evacuate. Time for the southern city-states to prepare their defenses. Someone had to stay. And Leonidas had known from the beginning that it would be him. He dismissed most of the Greek allies. The Thespians, brave as they were, refused to leave and stayed to fight alongside the Spartans. The Thebans also remained, though ancient sources suggest they may have been kept as hostages or that some of them were planning to surrender. But the 300 Spartans never considered leaving. This was what they had trained for their entire lives. This was the moment that justified every brutal day in the Agoge, every sacrifice, every hardship. They would hold the pass until they couldn't hold it any longer. And then they would keep fighting anyway. On the morning of the third day, Leonidas and his remaining warriors knew the Persians were coming from both directions. They prepared for battle one last time. They combed their hair. They checked their weapons. They said quiet prayers to the gods. And then they did something that shocked the Persians. Instead of waiting behind their wall, they marched out into the open pass. They formed their phalanx in the widest part of the pass and charged straight at the Persian army. 4 hours, they fought. Not defending a position now, but attacking, pushing forward, killing as many Persians as they could before the inevitable end. Their spears broke, so they fought with swords. Their swords broke, so they fought with knives and bare hands. They fought with a ferocity that terrified the Persians. These weren't men trying to survive. These were men who had already accepted death and were determined to make it count. Leonidas fell in the fighting. Accounts say he was struck down by Persian arrows and spears, and his body became the center of a desperate struggle. The Spartans formed a circle around their fallen king, fighting off wave after wave of Persians trying to claim his body as a trophy. For times the Persians pushed forward. For times the Spartans drove them back. But the immortals were now attacking from behind as well. The Spartans were being crushed from two sides. The surviving Spartans retreated to a small hill in the pass, a slight rise that gave them a final defensive position. They formed their last phalanx, shields locked, back to back, facing outward in all directions. And they waited. The Persians, having lost thousands of men to these 300 warriors, refused to charge again. Instead, they stood at a distance and fired arrows. Thousands of arrows. So many that, according to ancient accounts, they darkened the sky. There's a famous story about this moment. Before the battle, a local had warned the Spartans that the Persian archers were so numerous that their arrows would block out the sun. One Spartan warrior, a man named Dionysus, had replied, "Good, then we'll fight in the shade." And now, as the arrows fell like rain, as the last Spartans fell one by one, that dark joke became reality. They fought in the shade. And they died on their feet, weapons in hand, facing their enemy. Every single Spartan died at Thermopylae. Every one of the 300. The Thespians who stayed also died to the last man. 700 warriors who refused to abandon their Spartan brothers. Their sacrifice has been largely forgotten by history, but it shouldn't be. They chose to stand when they could have run. They chose death when they could have lived. After the battle, Xerxes ordered his men to search for Leonidas's body. When they found it, he had it beheaded and crucified, a sign of disrespect meant to humiliate the Spartan king. But it backfired. The Greeks who heard about it were enraged. The Spartans especially vowed vengeance. Xerxes had just made Leonidas a martyr. The Persian army continued its march into Greece. They burned Athens. They destroyed temples. They seemed unstoppable. But Thermopylae had changed something. The 3-day delay had given the Greek fleet time to position at Salamis, a narrow strait where the massive Persian fleet couldn't use its numbers effectively. The Greek navy, led by Athenian triremes, destroyed the Persian fleet in a stunning victory. Suddenly, Xerxes' supply lines were cut. His army was stranded in hostile territory, far from home, and the Greeks were no longer afraid. The next year, the Greeks met the Persian army at Plataea. This time, the Spartans brought their full army. 10,000 Spartan warriors, plus their Helot warriors and allies. They were led by Leonidas's nephew, Pausanias. And they remembered Thermopylae. They remembered their king. They remembered the 300. The Battle of Plataea was brutal, but the Spartans fought with a fury that terrified the Persians. They broke through the Persian lines, killed the Persian commander, and sent the entire army fleeing in panic. The invasion was over. Greece was saved. And all of it traced back to 3 days in a mountain pass. 300 men who stood when everyone else said it was impossible. Who fought when everyone else said it was hopeless. Who died so that their people could live. But here's the real question. Why do we still care? Why does this story matter 2,500 years later? We've had bigger battles. More soldiers. More advanced weapons. More dramatic last stands. So why Thermopylae? Why Leonidas and the 300? Because it's not really about the battle. It's about the choice. It's about knowing you're going to die and doing it anyway because someone has to. It's about being given an impossible task and saying yes. It's about ordinary men, and yes, they were just men, not superheroes, not gods, just men, doing something extraordinary because the moment demanded it. We tell this story because it reminds us what humans are capable of when we stop thinking about ourselves and start thinking about something bigger. Leonidas didn't fight for glory. He had already won glory. He was king of Sparta. He didn't fight for wealth. He had wealth. He didn't fight to survive. He knew survival was impossible. He fought because if he didn't, everything he loved would be destroyed. His family. His city. His way of life. He fought because someone had to be the first to stand, so that others would have the courage to stand too. The Spartans were far from perfect. Their society was brutal. They enslaved people. They valued war above almost everything else. I'm not here to romanticize them. But in that moment, in that pass, they became something more. They became a symbol. A symbol of courage, of sacrifice, of the idea that sometimes the right thing to do is also the hardest thing to do. After the battle, the Greeks erected a monument at Thermopylae. A stone lion for Leonidas. And they carved an epitaph, written by the poet Simonides. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. Simple. Direct. No boasting. No claims of glory. Just a statement of fact. We did our duty. We kept our word. We died as Spartans. That monument still stands, in a way. The physical stone has long since crumbled, but the story remains. It's been told and retold for 25 centuries. It's been painted, sculpted, written into plays and poems and novels. It's been adapted into movies, some more accurate than others. And every time it's told, the core truth remains the same. 300 men stood against an empire. They knew they couldn't win. And they fought anyway. So what can we learn from this? What does Thermopylae teach us in the 21st century, when most of us will never face a Persian army, never stand in a phalanx, never be asked to die for our country? I think it teaches us that courage isn't about not being afraid. Courage is being terrified and doing it anyway. It teaches us that sometimes the right thing to do is also the thing that costs us everything. And it teaches us that our actions, even our last actions, can echo forward through time in ways we can never predict. Leonidas thought he was buying time for Greece. He didn't know he was creating a legend that would inspire people for millennia. He didn't know that his name would be spoken with reverence 2,500 years later. He just knew that someone had to stand. And he chose to be that someone. Every one of us will face our own Thermopylae. Not a literal battle, but a moment where we have to choose. Do we do the easy thing, or do we do the right thing? Do we run, or do we stand? Do we think only of ourselves, or do we think of something bigger? The 300 Spartans teach us that in those moments, character matters. Duty matters. Honor matters. Not because these things will make us famous, but because these things make us human. If you made it this far, thank you. This is one of my favorite stories from history, and I hope I did it justice. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's greatest last stands, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Subscribe if you haven't already. And drop a comment. What would you have done in Leonidas's position? Would you have stayed, or would you have retreated to fight another day? There's no wrong answer. It's just worth thinking about. And here's something else to think about. The Persians eventually gave up trying to conquer Greece. After Plataea, after seeing what the Greeks were capable of, Xerxes went home and never came back. The invasion failed. And because it failed, Greek culture survived. Democracy survived. Philosophy survived. Western civilization as we know it survived. Which means that in a very real way, the world you live in today exists because 300 men decided to stand in a pass and fight. That's the power of sacrifice. That's the power of courage. That's why we remember Thermopylae. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.